Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So the NTIA has come out with guidance for states as far as the BEAD program goes to be able to provide service using alternative technologies, including satellite, low Earth orbit satellite. Be right back with more. Thanks for joining me. Rick Husey here with Broadband Deployment News. So this is fairly newsworthy. This happened a few days ago. So you see here proposed BEAD alternative broadband technology guidance. And I'll be talking about what alternative broadband technology would be, about priority broadband projects, reliable broadband service, all of that as covered in the BEAD program notice of funding opportunity. So we'll be going over that today as well as this guidance. So I linked to this page right here. This is a summary page that the NTIA put out on this. So I won't read through this because I am going to be going through the actual document, but you see here the date. You can read through that and you can actually comment on this. Anybody in the public can comment by basically right before midnight Eastern time on September 10th. So a few more days here. And there's a link, as I mentioned, down here to the actual document, which I'm going to look at right now. So see here, this is a draft pre-decisional document. So this is not completely final yet, but probably very close to it. And they are going to be taking comments, as we saw there. They've got a public comment open where you can submit comments, and that would certainly be appropriate for any service provider that has concerns about this or that has suggestions. Less likely for individual people in the public, like just a person who's got broadband service, but maybe for associations that are working with cable operators or phone companies or consumer organizations might want to be commenting on this. So it's very important. Again, I'm going to go through this. I've highlighted different areas in here so we don't have to read through the whole thing, but I think this will be helpful for you if you want to get a quick summary of what's in here and kind of the important parts. So just to start out here, let's read a few things. So the extremely high cost per location threshold, they're going to talk about that first, is a subsidy cost per location established by the states and utilized during the subgrantee selection process, above which a state may decline to select a proposal for reliable broadband service if use of an alternative technology meeting the BEAD program's technical requirements would be less expensive. So that's a mouthful, but whenever you see eligible entity in here, they're talking about the state generally or a territory, so the few of the U.S. territories that are in there. Sometimes I'll mess up and I'll say the whole thing, but generally if I say eligible entity, I'm talking about the state. And then we'll define some of these things like reliable broadband service here in a minute. In response to inquiries from states and other stakeholders, the NTIA is proposing to issue, and that's basically what this is, a BEAD alternative broadband technology policy notice to provide eligible entities with additional guidance regarding the use of alternative technologies to serve unserved and underserved locations within their jurisdiction. So this, again, is not final, but very close, I'm sure, to what would be final. NTIA seeks comment from the public, as mentioned, and then you can submit that to this address right here, bead@ntia.gov by, again, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on September 10th. So let's read through. I'm going to read through various sections of this that will hopefully explain what they're trying to accomplish and what they're suggesting be done. And again, it's very interesting. It's not just for satellites. It would also be unlicensed fixed wireless, but those are very different. So they really cover the LEO satellite, low Earth orbit satellite, pretty heavily in here. So the NTIA provides herein additional guidance to inform the allocation of BEAD program funds to projects utilizing an alternative technology that does not meet the BEAD program's definition of reliable broadband service, but otherwise satisfies the program's technical requirements. And that technical requirements part is important. We'll discuss that as well. Any eligible entity that received NTIA approval of Volume 2 of its BEAD initial proposal prior to the publication of this updated guidance, and that wishes to modify its Volume 2 or initial proposal funding request to reflect this updated guidance, should contact its federal program officer for direction. So there are a few states that have had those approvals received, and they can go ahead and get in contact and try to adjust that. Table of contents, we'll skim that, or skim past that. The BEAD NOFO establishes a clear hierarchy for awarding unserved and underserved service projects. First, priority broadband projects would be end-to-end fiber. Second, other reliable broadband service projects, and we'll define those in a minute. And then third, alternative technology projects where the cost to deploy reliable broadband service exceeds the extremely high cost per location threshold, and where the use of an alternative technology would be less expensive. So that extremely high cost per location threshold is where the states have to come up with kind of a line as to where they're going to say it's too expensive to deploy fiber or even another technology, another wire technology like cable modem service, for example. So they're then able to consider something else. So they've got to try to figure where that is. And a lot of the states are going to wait to do that to see which locations are the most difficult, where they're having a hard time getting people that want to serve those. Where the cost to deploy exceeds the high cost threshold, the BEAD NOFO directs states to seek out the most robust, affordable, and scalable technologies achievable under the circumstances particular to a location. Examples of alternative technologies include low Earth orbit satellite broadband service and unlicensed fixed wireless service. And it says it includes those. That's all I can think of that it would include. Geosynchronous satellite service does not qualify. So you've got your low Earth orbit satellites, and you've got fixed wireless that's all unlicensed. And we'll see here that that's basically all that's left, because we've got a priority broadband project. Again, that's end-to-end fiber, so that would be fiber to the prem, basically all the way to the customer. You've got reliable broadband service. That would be fiber technology, obviously cable modem technology. DSL, believe it or not sure why. And DSL has a hard time even meeting the speed requirements that would be in here. But if they did meet the speed requirements, that would be considered reliable. And then fixed wireless technology utilizing entirely licensed spectrum or using a hybrid of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. And I never understood the hybrid, because what does that mean, hybrid of the two? You've got, in certain areas, let's say you've got licensed spectrum, and does that mean in another area you could have unlicensed spectrum as long as you're providing service to both areas? I'm not sure. CBRS spectrum is considered licensed by rule. That's the spectrum that the FCC made available that's using a spectrum sharing paradigm, where if you've got an incumbent like the Navy, and the Navy uses that spectrum, if they are using it at that moment, then a operator that's using CBRS spectrum has to back off of that while that Navy is using that spectrum and switch somebody to a different portion of that spectrum. It works pretty well apparently, and that would be for people using general access licenses. There are priority access licenses under CBRS where that is licensed spectrum, and I don't believe they are using spectrum that would be used by the Navy. But then you've got general access that uses the full spectrum that's for CBRS, and those do share the spectrum. They can share it among each other, like different operators can share that spectrum. Again, you've got the incumbent sharing that, and there's a methodology of sharing that that makes it where there's not supposed to be any interference. So those are considered licensed by rule, and that would qualify for BEAD. That would not have to be an alternative technology. So that would be considered reliable broadband. I find it funny that these alternative technologies, if they're not reliable broadband service, does that mean they're unreliable broadband service? I wouldn't want to be in that category, but then again, Starlink is very reliable, relatively speaking, compared to a lot of technologies. So I think that they just call it reliable broadband service. That was the name. So I wouldn't say that it's unreliable if you don't fall in that category. And then underserved and unserved. Underserved would be 100 by 20 or greater. And then underserved would be less than 25 by 3. So you've got that area in between, let's say 25 by 3 to 100 by 20, that's considered underserved. So those are your categories there. And basically, the states are supposed to get all unserved locations covered under BEAD, and hopefully all of their underserved locations, but the unserved are the ones that have the first priority of getting service. Alternative technologies. So the term alternative technology describes any broadband access technology that does not qualify as reliable broadband service, including unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellites, but meets the BEAD program's minimum technical requirements of speeds not less than 100 by 20 and equal to 100 milliseconds round trip. So again, they've got to be able to provide service where somebody is not underserved. It's got to be 100 or 20 and better, and it's got to meet the 100 millisecond latency. Now, satellite broadband has no problem with 100 milliseconds. Starlink scores at, I think at most usually 60 milliseconds round trip. So they got no problem there. They have been very good at getting over 100 megabits per second. You know, sometimes they go below that as they get more subscribers in an area, but then they get more satellites up and they get above that. So their speeds have actually been going up. On the upload speed, it's been a little bit more of a challenge. They've been under 20 quite a bit. I don't think they get over 20 very often. If they do, they have a few times on individual subscribers, but that's going to be more of a challenge. But that's been going up as well. So they started out where their averages were like, you know, in the 10, and their speeds for different individual subscribers have gone up over time. So they're getting better at that. So they may be able to meet this if they, with maybe new base stations that are coming out, or possibly their new satellites that they're putting up. It's possible that they'll be able to meet those requirements, but they have to meet that. So for them to be considered an alternative technology, they do have to provide these speeds of 100 by 20 and this latency, and there are monitoring that they have to do. So they're going to have to do testing and document this as part of the BEAD program. And then there's the geo satellites that do not qualify. Again, those are satellites that are, you know, tens of thousands of miles in space. So they're far away, but because they're far away, they can reach a large swath of the Earth that they're over. So they're staying in one place over one portion of the Earth. They can reach a large swath of the Earth doing that. But because they're so far, the latency is very high and their speeds are not nearly as good as it would be for low Earth orbit satellites. So low Earth orbit satellites are hundreds of miles instead of tens of thousands. It could be like 20 or 30,000 miles versus, let's say, 400 miles, 500 miles for a low Earth orbit satellite. Latency, again, 60 milliseconds, better than that for those satellites. So geosynchronous does not qualify. Locations where alternative technologies already exist. The state may find itself with project areas for which no prospective subgrantee has submitted an offer to deploy reliable broadband service, or project areas for which prospective subgrantees have submitted proposals to deploy reliable broadband service only at a subsidy amounts that exceed their high-cost threshold. In this situation, eligible entities may consider alternative technologies to fulfill their BEAD program obligations, subject to the guidance provided in this section. So if they don't get anybody in a particular area, or if a fiber provider comes in and says, yeah, we'll do this and it's going to cost $15,000 per location, and that is over the state's extremely high cost threshold, then the state at that point can say, okay, we're not going to do fiber, and they have the opportunity to look for other technologies like unlicensed fixed wireless or licensed fixed wireless if somebody wanted to come in and do that, or and that would be reliable broadband, or low Earth orbit satellite, assuming they meet the technical requirements. So there's a couple of cases here when this takes place. So 3.1, case 1, enforceable commitments for alternative technologies. So, and these are cases where you cannot use BEAD funding for these alternative technologies right here. So if an enforceable commitment to deploy an alternative technology is present, the eligible entity must determine whether the funding program includes network performance monitoring that verifies that the service is provided at or above the BEAD program's benchmark for at least 4 years after the date of submission of the final proposal. When such network performance monitoring is included as part of the alternative technology enforceable commitment, NTIA will not consider the BEAD funding for alternative technologies as part of a BEAD deployment project that is necessary, and therefore no such costs will be allowed. So in other words, if there's, let's say, ARPA or somebody provided funding for this, and it's a fixed wireless, unlicensed fixed wireless, and it has monitoring as part of the, I can't remember if it does, but if it has monitoring as part of that, then that would be considered served already in a sense. Case 2, provider can demonstrate that it currently meets BEAD requirements for alternative deployments. Case 2, determine whether an alternative technology provider serving some or all locations in the project area can demonstrate that it currently meets the BEAD program requirements. If alternative technology service is already meeting BEAD program requirements, then BEAD funds are not necessary for those locations and will not be allowed. So again, if you have an unlicensed fixed wireless provider in that area, then that won't be allowed. BEAD funding won't be allowed. Now, I don't know about satellite, because satellite, again, is pretty much everywhere. So what does that mean for them? Does that mean if that would, to me, would mean that all of these areas are covered already by an alternative service that would meet, that would demonstrate that it currently meets the BEAD program requirements. And satellite can certainly meet that today in a lot of areas. So maybe the upstream is the challenge. I don't know. So let's see, where was I? To make this determination for locations where the National Broadband Map shows an existing alternative technology service, and the map does show whether satellite, Starlink is there as well as other wireless providers, then the states are required to gather more information about the sufficiency of the existing service to determine whether a BEAD deployment project is reasonable and necessary. The state must give an alternative technology provider that's currently offering services the opportunity to demonstrate to the entity, eligible entity of the state, its capability to offer BEAD qualifying services to all locations in the project area. Alternative technology providers presumably have an interest in demonstrating such a capability to prevent competition with a potential BEAD-funded provider. So again, does that mean that if this is a area where the state wants to look at an alternative provider and Starlink is up there and Starlink can demonstrate that they can meet the requirements, then does that mean that the state doesn't pay them for that because they're already up there? They can't give them the funds? That doesn't make any sense, because the whole purpose of this document is to provide funding for these alternative technologies. So I don't fully understand this part. To determine whether an existing alternative technology provider currently meets the BEAD program requirements, the state must consider two components: whether the existing alternative technology provider possesses the financial and managerial capacity to deliver the service, meeting the BEAD program's technical requirements to all locations, or whether the existing, whether the existing alternative technology provider has the technical and operational capacity, so financial and technical, to deliver the service meeting the BEAD program's technical requirements to all locations. While the existing alternative technology provider does not have to comply with the qualifications for BEAD subgrantees, as described in these sections of the NOFO, eligible entities must consider factors relevant to financial, managerial, technical, and operational capacity. So again, a little confusing there for me. States should carefully evaluate whether the existing alternative technology provider can reasonably acquire or lease facilities necessary to serve every BSL in the project area within the same 4-year period expected of a reliable broadband service provider. States must give the alternative provider currently serving some or all of the project area at least 7 days to indicate an interest in qualifying under Case 2. Eligible entities can either post a public notice or contact all existing providers listed in the National Broadband Map that offer services that do not qualify as reliable broadband service. So either of those, not both. If no provider responds within that period for some or all locations, the state can proceed to Case 3. If a provider wants to be considered for Case 2, the state shall allow the provider at least 30 days to submit the necessary documentation. If a provider applies for Case 2 consideration but does not meet the Case 2 criteria, it does not exclude them from being considered for Case 3. The part here that caught my eye was that it could be either. So I think what it's saying here is the state can just post a public notice, and then if there's a current provider in that area, they would have to see that public notice, and they only have 7 days to respond to it. So I would think the states would want to be reaching out, actually going to the broadband map and saying, okay, who has said that they provide service here, and then contacting those folks. And of course, that broadband map data is like 6 months old. So anyway, that's surprising that they could do either of those and not require them to do both, actually. Case 3, BEAD investments in alternative technologies. So this would be where you can actually provide BEAD funding to these alternative technologies. If neither of the scenarios above, cases 1 and 2, apply, eligible entities must identify a last-mile broadband deployment project to serve the relevant unserved or underserved locations in order to make the required final proposal certification that service will be delivered to all unserved and is financially feasible underserved locations. So again, that when they provide their final proposal, they need to be saying, we can reach every unserved location with our proposal, and hopefully every underserved, or the vast majority of underserved locations as well. I don't believe that's required, but unserved is required. Alternative technology providers that were identified as serving locations under Case 2, but did not respond to the eligible entity in a timely manner, may be determined to be incapable of carrying out activities funded by the subgrant in a competent manner, and lack the managerial capacity to meet such other requirements as have been prescribed by the Assistant Secretary. In this situation, such providers are ineligible to become BEAD subgrantees for these locations. So again, this is surprising to me because I think what it's saying is if a provider could have met this case 2 here, they could have met it, but they didn't see the public notice and they weren't contacted by the state. They happen to miss 7 days where they saw public notice. Then does that disqualify them? That's what it says to me. It's not saying that they were contacted and didn't respond in 30 days. It says they were identified. Well, maybe it does say that. Alternative technology providers that were identified as serving locations under case 2, but did not respond. Well, does that mean that they put out a public notice, or does that mean that they actually contacted? Does that mean the state contacted the service provider and they didn't respond in a timely manner? They have to get in within 30 days. Where they have to say, maybe they had to raise their hand and say, yeah, we want to be involved in this, and then they have to get in 30 days. But again, if it's just a public notice, that's not fair, that somebody could miss a public notice and then be considered that that they're not competent and have the managerial capacity to be able to do that. So that's a question mark for me. Awarding alternative broadband technology subgrants, the selection mechanism. A competitive subgrantee selection round open to all types of eligible providers and technologies. Oh, these are the 2 options that they have. So when they're selecting, so the first thing they can do is they can do a open grant process, basically a competitive grant process for everyone. That includes those that would be providing reliable broadband, priority broadband, so it could be fiber, reliable broadband, which would be fiber, and everybody else that would be considered reliable. And then those that are unreliable, or I should say the alternative technologies, they could do a competitive subgrantee selection round open to all of those. Or following a subgrantee selection process open to the priority broadband service and reliable broadband service providers, then a competitive subgrantee selection round seeking only alternative technology proposals. So they've got those 2 options. I think most states are going to do number 2 here because what they're going to want to do is see where their holes are and where they have challenges and and that's going to help them determine where their extremely high cost threshold is. So I think what most states are going to do is they're going to do basically a competitive selection between the reliable broadband providers, the priority broadband providers, basically everybody that can do the reliable broadband. Again, see where their holes are, which locations nobody has bid for, and then open those locations up to the competitive subgrantee selection of the alternative providers. And again, there's only 2. There could be I shouldn't say that. There could be several unlicensed fixed wireless providers that want to do that, and then Starlink, and then possibly also Project Kuiper. If an eligible entity has solicited proposals, including proposals for alternative technology projects, but not received any proposals to serve a location or group of locations that are unserved or underserved, it may engage directly with existing providers or prospective subgrantees about alternative technology projects. In circumstances in which eligible entities are directly engaging with existing providers or prospective subgrantees, eligible entities must work to ensure that their approach is as transparent as possible. So the way I read this is, again, if they get the first round of responses back and there are areas that are open, nobody's bid on anything, they could be proactive and reach out. They could reach out to folks that provide fiber or folks that provide cable modem service and say, hey, we didn't get anything here. Are you guys interested? They could reach out to Starlink. They could reach out to fixed wireless operators that could do something maybe with unlicensed spectrum or licensed spectrum. But they need to be above board. So I would think what they're saying here is they need to be transparent as possible to make sure that anybody that would be interested in that territory knows that they're then reaching out to others. Eligible entities may select a proposal for an alternative technology only where there is no reliable broadband service technology meeting the BEAD program's technical requirements that would be deployable for a subsidy of less than the high cost threshold, extremely high cost threshold at a given location. So again, as they're reaching out to these people, if somebody that could provide a reliable broadband service said, yeah, we'll do it, and we'll do it for this amount, and that's under the extremely high cost threshold, then the state can't pick somebody else like a Starlink or unlicensed fixed wireless because they've got something from a provider that has given them a bid that would be below their threshold. Subgrantee qualifications. The subgrantee qualification requirements in the BEAD NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, include the specific requirements for subgrantees deploying network projects apply to prospective subgrantee that, wait a minute, let me read that again. The subgrantee qualification requirements in the BEAD NOFO, including the specific requirements for subgrantees deploying network projects, apply to prospective subgrantee that seeks to deploy alternative technologies using BEAD funds. Okay. Not sure when I highlighted that. I think I understood it. I don't now. Subgrantee obligations. Alternative technology projects with BEAD funds must comply with all obligations articulated in the BEAD NOFO, such as the speed, latency requirements, network outage limitations, low-cost broadband service option, and other service obligations, network management practices, and cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. So they have to have a cybersecurity plan in place that, and the technology in place that would meet the NIST cybersecurity framework. Subgrantees must also be able to initiate broadband service within 10 business days of a request to any covered BSL, broadband service location, in the project area, with no charges or delays attributed to the extension of the service. So it's not like you call and they say, yeah, we'll be out there. It's going to be a month. We've got to do some trenching, and it's going to cost you $10,000 to get you connected. They can't do that. It's got to be that 10-day requirement with no additional charges. Subgrantees must also abide by the BEAD network performance and reliability monitoring rules. And given the higher geographic variability in performance compared to fiber networks, eligible entities may require higher spatial sampling ratios for alternative technology projects and extend sampling requirements to individual geographic areas rather than the whole state or territory. So the monitoring is something that's got to be done on a regular basis. I think it's maybe once a quarter. It's the same monitoring that's was done for CAF2 and is being done for RDOF. And you've got to use certain number of homes within an area or certain number of locations within an area. I think what they're saying here, you've got broad areas for that testing. Here they're saying it might need to be a narrower area. Finally, it is NTIA's policy to ensure that BEAD funds are used to bring affordable broadband to all Americans. The acquisition and installation of end-user equipment needed to access alternative technologies can be substantially more expensive than the equipment acquisition and installation costs associated with other last-mile broadband technologies. Therefore, to receive approval for its final proposal for a last-mile broadband deployment project in which the subgrantee will deploy an alternative technology for last-mile solution, the state must include in any subgrant agreement, the cost of any eligible initial non-recurring fees charged to new subscribers necessary to connect the BSL, such as costs for installation or customer prem equipment, for example, residential radio nodes or satellite terminals. So, and this is interesting because I've said that I've always wondered what they were going to do with satellite, because again, the satellite infrastructure is circling already above the earth. It's not like a fiber operator that's going to say, okay, we're going to deploy the fiber in this area, and then they're going to get paid for that, and that's going to help defray the cost of deployment. Here they're starting to talk about the cost of the equipment and how that is a burden in this case. And that equipment could be, I think from Starlink, I think it's $300 or so now. It used to be $500. I think it's $300. I think their cost is somewhere around that. So they're not making any money, I think, on those terminals. It's going to be, maybe Wi-Fi access points might be expensive as well. Not the access point, the terminals. So I think that's what they're talking about there. One-time initial costs such as installation and customer prem equipment are eligible uses of BEAD funds, and including these costs in the sub-grant will help ensure installation and equipment costs are not a barrier to adoption for those Americans residing in BSLs served by alternative technologies funded through the BEAD program. So again, I had suspected that they might make the equipment, that might be where they would apply some of the funding would be, if somebody's going to have to pay $300 to get this equipment, maybe they get that for free, or maybe they get it knocked down to what, it might cost for a cable modem. Cable modems, $30, $50, they're not expensive. I think it's probably the same for the ONTs that would be ONTs and OUs that would connect to fiber customer. You throw Wi-Fi in there, it's going to be more expensive. But again, these terminals that you'd have for satellite, they're pretty expensive. So that is a valid use for the BEAD funding. And there's other they also talk about something else that I thought they might do in here, which we'll get to in a minute. Additional flexibility for subgrants for last mile LEO deployments. The BEAD NOFO identifies the following eligible uses of funding in connection with last mile deployments, and it talks about all the things that are in the notice of funding opportunity. You've got construction, you've got long-term leases, deployment of internet and Wi-Fi infrastructure for MDUs, engineering design, permitting, etc., personnel costs, salaries, fringe benefits for staff, project managers, program directors, those kinds of things. We're talking about building out the service at this point. This is not operating the service, but this is getting things built out. Network software upgrades, including but not limited to cybersecurity solutions. So that's something. And by the way, if you need cybersecurity, go to zquorum.com. If you need NIST compliance and you're going to be getting BEAD funding, go to zquorum.com/cybersecurity. We can help you there because you do have to have cybersecurity in place to get BEAD funding. And we can provide a lot of those services at much less than if you're going to try to do it yourself. Here, training for cybersecurity professionals, workforce development, those kinds of things. So again, this is for things related to here, support, deployment, maintenance, and upgrades. For the avoidance of all doubt, all of these uses are eligible uses for funding in connection with last mile broadband deployments using alternative technologies. So same thing. In addition, for the limited purposes of last mile deployment projects that rely upon low Earth orbit satellite technology to deliver the last mile service to the broadband service location, NTIA will provide eligible entities, the states, additional flexibility to use BEAD funds for the reservation of network capacity to meet the capacity requirement previously addressed. So that's the other thing I was saying that they might do with this. So it's interesting that that's where that landed. So I was thinking, again, you've got the satellites above there. The only thing that might need to be done is that somebody like Starlink might need to launch additional satellites and put more satellites in the area of the constellation that would be circling those areas, those unserved areas, or additional base station capacity, those kinds of things, to be able to meet the requirements. So in order to do that, it's not like they're going to go, again, it's not like they're going to go, you're not going to pay for a satellite launch, but if you're going to paying for capacity, that's a different way to look at that. First, NTI will require, and this is subject to the following conditions. First, NTI will require that the state apply a period of performance for any LEO capacity subgrant that concludes 10 years after the date upon which the subgrantee certifies to the state that it began providing broadband service to each customer in the project area that desires broadband service. So instead of 4 years, it's going to be 10 years. NTI will issue a no-cost extension of the period of performance for the state grants for a similar duration and provide additional time for award closeout. So the states would normally be closing out all of this in 4 years, but here they're saying they're going to extend it another 6 years on just the LEO stuff. Second, the recipient of an LEO capacity subgrant must begin providing broadband service to each customer that desires broadband service not later than 4 years from the date of the subgrant. That would be no issue for Starlink, which is up there right now. Again, they have to meet the 100 by 20, and there might be some capacity they have to add to do that, to get to that point, certainly on the upstream. Now, so 4 years seems no problem, but then you've got Project Kuiper. That's Amazon's satellite, and they at this point, as far as I know, have only got 2 satellites up that they're doing testing with. They plan on having 3,200 satellites up there. Starlink's already got well over that. There, I think, 4,000 or 5,000, I believe, satellites that they've got deployed now. Kuiper is planning on having fewer. I believe they're a little bit higher up, so they can be a little further out, 3,200. But they're nowhere near that yet. They haven't deployed anybody in production yet. They were supposed to be launching satellites this year. The year's not over. And then they've got time. So they've got 4 years to be able to get all of that done. If they do get approved, they're going to have to get approved, which means they've got to demonstrate that they're going to have this capability up within 4 years. That's going to be a hard case to make if you've already got Starlink there. So we maybe get down to costs and those kinds of things. If, let's say, Starlink would be competing with Project Kuiper, with Amazon. Third, eligible entities must ensure the reasonableness of the cost of the capacity on a per-location basis for which BEAD funding will be used. NTIA will require states to explain in their final proposal how the state calculated the cost of the network capacity per location to the recipient of an LEO capacity subgrant. And again, they remind you that this does not include a profit of any kind in here. They mention that several times in here. Fourth, eligible entities shall reimburse recipients of LEO capacity subgrants only for the amount of capacity actually used, such as by reimbursing based on the number of actual subscribers to the broadband service in the project area in a period of time, for example, a month or year, multiplied by the per location cost of the capacity. Fifth, states must estimate the amount of BEAD funding that will be needed during the period of performance to reimburse recipients of the capacity grants. An acceptable estimate would be 50% of the covered locations within a project area subscribing to broadband service from the date upon which the service is available, and continuing through the conclusion of the period of performance. Again, I believe this is going to be 10 years. Eligible entities may propose for NTIA approval an alternative estimate of the BEAD funding needed for reimbursement, but must demonstrate the reasonableness of the estimated amount in the final proposal. Grant administration considerations. All grant awards and subawards must follow the rules and regulations listed in the BEAD NOFO. NTIA reminds subgrantees, again, that a profit or fee, I've read this a few times in here, profit or fee or other incremental charge above actual cost incurred by a subgrantee is not allowable cost under the BEAD program. Additionally, as is the case for all other deployment projects, eligible entities must distribute funding to subgrantees for all alternative technology deployment projects on a reimbursable basis, which allows the state to withhold funds if the subgrantee fails to take actions the funds are meant to subsidize. So you don't, again, you don't do this all at once because you need to have some control over what the subgrantee does. But of course, there's not a lot of deployment going on with low Earth orbit satellites. It's up there. You're paying for capacity. It's not like you've got a fiber operator that's going to be deploying fiber over a period of time, like 1, 2, 3 years. They've got to get it all done, let's say within 4 years. And you're reimbursing them as they're doing that. So it's a little bit different here. So it's kind of hard to track and to put together. The build-out deadline for all last-mile broadband deployment projects remains 4 years. So it's still a 4-year build-out for whoever it is, whether it's fiber, cable, fixed wireless. For low Earth orbit satellite, again, it's 4 years. For Starlink, not an issue. For something like Project Kuiper from Amazon, they've got time, but they've got to get their satellite constellation up there to be able to provide the kind of speeds that would get them up over the 100 by 20 and to be able to cover all of the areas that they're going to be bidding on. Let's see, the period of performance for LEO capacity subgrant will be 10 years. So they still got to get it done in 4 years. The period of performance is 10 years from the date upon which the subgrantee certifies to the state that it began providing service. And we read all of that already in another spot. And then there's an appendix here where it provides some other possibilities. This is where they're seeking comment. And this is where, as I read it, I know Starlink was meeting with the NTIA talking about this recently. And I'm thinking Starlink came out and said, well, here are some challenges we have that you might want to take into account. So I'm reading this as this is what Starlink came up with, and this is what the NTIA is saying. What about this and what about that? So you see here, NTIA strongly believes that LEO capacity subgrant should be used to reimburse costs for the actual delivery of service to consumers and businesses. So unlike, let's say, a BEAD grant for a fiber operator where the money is primarily going to the build out of the infrastructure. Once that's done, it's done. There could be some money used for some subsidies to reduce the cost for certain people, those kinds of things. But you're not going to pay for the ongoing operation of that broadband network. They're saying here they believe that the money, again, the technology's up there, the infrastructure is already up there. So what are you going to pay for? Again, you could pay for the terminal, as I mentioned, and you can pay for capacity or an ongoing basis to try to reimburse the cost of the actual delivery of the service to the consumers and businesses. So that, it looks like, is what they're aiming at, is to make this less expensive for them. So again, you've got the terminal cost, but then you've got the cost of the service. So right now, Starlink is costing $120 per month, whereas if you've got a fiber operator in a suburban or urban area, $70, $80 a month for a gig, something like that. So big difference there. So how do we get it closer to being what it would be for, let's say, fiber? To effectuate this, NTIA is proposing that states base reimbursement to recipients of LEO capacity subgrants on the amount of capacity actually used as measured by subscription rates in the project area. Should NTIA allow, they have a question here, when they're talking, because they talk about the fact that they recognize that the LEO capacity subgrants will need to be made, will be upfront capital investments in their networks to ensure the availability of sufficient capacity in a project area. Because that's something that they're upgrading their infrastructure as opposed to putting new infrastructure up there. But so I guess that's what they're saying. Should the NTIA allow eligible entities, the states, to make a supplemental reimbursement payment to recipients of LEO capacity subgrants early in the period of performance, before maybe they get a lot of subscribers? Alternatively, should NTIA allow states to compensate a recipient of a LEO capacity subgrant for all BSLs in a project area, regardless of subscription rates in the early years of the period of performance? So rather than whether somebody's subscribed, they just give them the capacity grant for all locations because the number of subscribers are going to be small in the beginning. And they've got another option here. Should the NTIA allow eligible entities to employ a tiered subscription reimbursement structure? For example, in a subscription reimbursement structure based on tiers of 25 broadband serviceable locations, a state would reimburse a recipient for 25 BSLs if 1 to 25 of those locations in the project area were subscribing. So that way, when the service is launching and you have only a handful of people sign up for some period of time, then the Starlink, let's use their name, that's who it's most likely going to be. Starlink gets paid for 25 of locations, even though only 5 at that point are subscribing. Then if they get to 26 to 50, let's say here, so 1 to 25 in the project area subscribing, or for 50 subscribers, if 26 to 50 of the BSLs in the project area were subscribers, and so on. So if they get 27, then they're getting paid for 50 subscribers, all the way up to 50 subscribers. So that's another option they offer there. For eligible entities that elect to, they mentioned the fact that NTIA is proposing to require the LEO providers to dedicate 5 megs of capacity or 2 terabytes of usage per month to each subscribing BSL in a project area under this LEO capacity subgrant. So that's something that they have to make sure that they have in place as part of this. For states that elect to make LEO capacity subgrants, NTIA will issue a no-cost extension. Yeah, I already mentioned that. That's in there a couple of times. They mention that. They say, what actions can NTIA take to reduce the administrative burden associated with BEAD grants after an eligible entity has closed out all of the subgrants other than LEO capacity subgrants? So they're saying here they're extending this 10 years for only these LEO subgrantees. So that means the state in 4 years, they're going to be pretty much done. Hey, we're done. But then they've got 6 more years that they've got to maintain these grants, these capacity grants for these LEOs. Is there something they can do to reduce the burden of that administrative process there? Then they mention here the performance requirements of the BEAD program may necessitate that LEO providers reserve capacity for future customers in order to guarantee that those customers could be served within 10 business days if requested. I think most could be served within 10 business days. Now, they have to, and generally these are self-service kinds of things. So when Starlink hooks somebody up, it's supposedly not that hard. They send you the base station, the terminal, and you set it up, and it's supposed to, you got to put it somewhere where it has a view of the sky that you need to reach. And it can be a pretty small area because, again, these satellites are moving over in succession in these constellations. And it will track that. And it will automatically find those and hook up. So it's not that hard, apparently, to do it. But they've got to send it to you. So I don't know if that includes the shipping time. But I don't know about the capacity, again, other than they might have to get capacity at base stations or get more satellites repositioned or launch, those kinds of things. But I would think they'd be able to connect up people in 10 days. So I'm not sure what they're going after here. LEO providers, because of service, may be able to be deployed without the construction of additional terrestrial infrastructure, right? May be able to substantially accelerate that timeline. To account for these considerations, should the NTIA consider alternative LEO reimbursement models where the LEO subgrantees may begin providing service and receive corresponding grant funds through LEO capacity subgrants before certifying the completion of a network build out. I don't know why they're asking that. That's the last one. So maybe you can read that and make sense of it. So again, that's the entire document. I didn't read every bit of it, but hopefully that gave you a good idea of what's in there, especially as related to satellite technology. So if you are a internet service provider that's planning on providing BEAD funding, or even if you don't plan on, getting BEAD funding, or even don't plan on applying for BEAD funding, then you would want to be interested in this, because if you're maybe an unlicensed fixed wireless provider in an area, you certainly want to be considered possibly for BEAD funding if you can get it, or as an alternative provider. You don't want somebody to be able to get funded and then overbuild you if you could have provided the service, if it's going to be an alternative provider. If you're unlicensed in an area, then you are at risk, because a fiber operator could come in, for example, or even a licensed fixed wireless provider could come in and overbuild you or over air you. That being the case for fixed wireless, you'd need to either get licensed spectrum so that you could then be a reliable broadband service provider, or you have the risk of having somebody come in there and be funded to provide service in your area. So you need to be aware of that. So it would be good for any provider to know about what's going on here, especially as it concerns Starlink. And it'd be interesting to see what comments they get back on this. And when they do that, I'll probably come back on in another stream and talk about the final, maybe just the changes and any comments that they've gotten from the public and from associations and operators, those kinds of things. Appreciate you joining me today. If you're not subscribed to our channel, click the subscribe button, ring the bell to be notified when I'm live. And if this was helpful, if you maybe heard about this but didn't go through the document yet, if this was a good summary for you, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate that. So thanks for joining me today, and I will see you next time for Broadband Deployment News. Take care.